the Scottsboro Boys. Opened at the Vineyard Theater off Broadway in 2010. It had book by David Thompson and music and lyrics by John Kander and Fred Ebb. The show was one of the projects that Kander and Ebb were working on at the time of Fred Ebb's death in 2004.
The Scottsboro Boys chronicled the true story of 9 African-American young men and boys who were falsely accused of raping 2 white women in 1931 Alabama. They were all unfairly jailed and sentenced to the electric chair. These were 9 real young men who existed and who the American South condemned, from a 13-year-old boy who didn't even know what rape was, to Haywood Patterson, the most outspoken of men. The musical utilized a minstrel show format to tell the story. It was a cast of all black actors except for John Cullum, who played the interlocutor. In fact, Cullum had been a child growing up in the South during the 6 years of the Scottsboro Boys' trials.
It's actually them. According to most critics, the show was the greatest musical of the season while at the Vineyard. The Post's Elizabeth Vincentelli called the show a masterwork, both daring and highly entertaining. Susan Stroman has given the show the best production possible at the intimate Vineyard Theater. The book, score, and staging are so organically linked you can't imagine one without the others. The creative team had begun working on the show together in 2002, but after Ebb's death, it was stopped entirely. In 2008, John Kander reached out to Susan Stroman and David Thompson to say that he wanted to finish the lyrics and that he felt it was important that they move on with the project.
Kander and Ebb had worked together for 42 years, and only 4 songs for the show were completed when Ebb died. After diving back into the project, John Kander told Michael Riedel, "I try to channel Freddie, but I end up shaking my fist at him because I miss him so much." We wrote together almost every day, and it was a lot more fun writing with him than it is writing alone.
While the show got mostly rave notices at the Vineyard, there were several critics who thought there was still work to be done. Rather than rush the Scottsboro Boys directly to Broadway, lead producers, welcome back Barry and Fran Weisler, decided to take the time to bring the show to the Guthrie for further development, as well as give time for a planned-out marketing and press campaign. They had 13 years of Chicago revival money in their pockets, and they wanted to give what was likely to be Kander and Ebb's last Broadway show its best possible shot.
Now, there were a lot of comparisons to Chicago, but the Scottsboro Boys was harder material for many. Now, while Chicago satirized America's worship of celebrity through fictionalized exploits about merry murderesses, this show retold a harder, darker story about America's past. Audiences could enjoy the parallels between the justice system and showbiz razzle-dazzle. They couldn't enjoy a tap dance about the electric chair in quite the same way. There was also a big number about dirty Jew money. The minstrel show framework was meant to show parallels between the racism of the story and the racism of minstrelsy.
While the concept of the Scottsboro Boys was stylized, the content was sharp and sad. Several critics, even those who really liked the show, mentioned feeling uncomfortable and squirming in their seats. I think that's amazing. If you can write a musical that makes people squirm in their seats, like, that is a heroic musical. Because it's saying something, and that's the best. Isherwood wrote, "The Scottsboro Boys earns admiration for its stylistic daring and obvious ambition, but I'm not sure it's possible to honor the experience of the men it portrays while turning their suffering into a colorful slideshow." Everyone was uncomfortable. "The challenge is enticing us to cackle knowingly at the plague of racism at one moment and arousing sorrow and sympathy for its victims the next."
Backstage said, "It packs a punch. Here's to the creative team for insisting on delivering the show they wanted." The Scottsboro Boys sets a high bar for Broadway musicals this season. The New York Post called it a thrillingly inventive and entertaining night at the theater. You'll laugh, you'll cry, you'll be moved. What could be more Broadway than that?
The AM News headline was, "Scottsboro Boys is a blemish on Broadway." Critic Linda Armstrong, wait for this, went on to say, "This production sets Broadway back to the mid-18th century when minstrel shows began." Didn't understand what was happening. "It is so offensive to African Americans that I just couldn't believe what I was seeing. The very serious, racist, and horrific story of the Scottsboro Boys is presented through a comedic minstrel show format." Opposite views, as you can see. But there was even a third camp of critics. The New Yorker griped that they absolutely loved the daring of the show, but that Stroman had pulled back too much from the ugliness of the material by stressing that the piece was an entertainment. You cannot please anybody.
So please yourself.
It's actually true. That's actually true.
And I'm talking about masturbation. When the show started performances at the Lyceum, it was greeted by protesters who argued that the use of minstrelsy and blackface were racist. Much like the AM News, the protesters had missed the point. Stroman gave a statement saying she was disappointed that the protesters misunderstood that the creators were not celebrating the minstrel tradition, but rather using it to reveal the evils of the system. Even Whoopi Goldberg weighed in on The View, saying that it seemed like none of the protesters had actually seen the show and that she really admired it.
There she is saying that there. The Scottsboro Boys struggled through several losing weeks at the box office and then closed after only 49 performances. The show is regarded highly in the theater community by nearly everyone who saw it, inspiring admiration from most audiences, but they could not sell a ticket to a tourist to save their lives. Had the show come to Broadway near the end of the 2010 Tony season instead of going to the Guthrie for further development, it may have met quite a different fate. The 2010 season was a dry one for new musicals, especially those with original scores, and this one would have come with the momentum from the Vineyard, the critics' cheers, straight from downtown, not to mention the excitement of a brand new Kander and Ebb score. Kander said, "When Fred Up died in 2004, we were working on the show, working in the same room. It took forever to regain my confidence. I had to conjure him up. But this is the most intense, fulfilling piece I have ever worked on. It's rich material, not frivolous. Listen, when you go to Shakespeare, it's not to have a bad time. One thing you can never be is bored. This tells a great story in music. People will go out singing several of the songs." The show closed on Broadway in December, but come Tony nomination time in May, it received 12 nominations, the most nomination of any musical ever that had already closed. It didn't win any.
When the show was at the Vineyard, Riedel had urged everyone to get downtown to see the hit of the season featuring Brandon Victor Dixon as Haywood Patterson in what will be a star-making turn. Variety called Dixon charismatic and affecting, and the Times called out his 11 o'clock number as the highlight of the show. When the Scottsboro Boys transferred to Broadway, as was planned, Dixon was attached to a musical about Ray Charles that was booked into the Barrymore. He was replaced for the Broadway run with Joshua Henry, and the Ray Charles musical unfortunately never materialized. So, audiences at the Vineyard were the only ones who got to see his performance in the show. Here to speak about and sing from the Scottsboro Boys, Brandon Victor Dixon.
Hello, everybody. I know we're supposed to tell a story about the show. I remember when Jennifer asked me about that, I was like, I don't know that I have any specific stories from the show. There's actually only one story about my experience in the show that really pops into my brain, and I wasn't sure whether it was the right one to tell, but considering this introduction, it seems perfect, actually. It was a very special experience doing that show. It's one of the, I've been blessed to work on some really wonderful productions with some great, creative artists, but it was probably the smartest production that I've ever been a part of. It was just very intelligently written and very intelligently designed, both in terms of the text itself, but just the manner in which they structured the show. It operated on so many different levels, and like they said in the introduction, I mean, it wasn't just a piece that made you think about the story. It really made you feel what was going on with these boys, and it blended that line between minstrelsy and naturalism. The minstrel show portion of the show really told the story of the Scottsboro Boys as a minstrel show, but in between those scenes, you got the experience of them going through it and being forced to tell their story through minstrelsy, which is a whole other thing. And the show was funny and entertaining, but it was communicated in such a way that made the audience uncomfortable with what they were laughing at and what they were experiencing, which is what theater is supposed to do. Not necessarily make you feel uncomfortable, but make you feel. And it should make you feel a wide variety of things, and I think that's wonderful about it. But, it was a special experience both from working on it down at the Atlantic Theater Company, which is where we did it. They wanted to be away from the heart of Broadway, where they could kind of finish their final work. And also then moving into the Vineyard, which is a really wonderful family that nurtures work and nurtures artists. It was just a really great experience being with everybody. And our cast, too. Such a small cast, but, very young, developing artists, but also people like Coleman Domingo, who, is just tremendous in everything he does. I first saw him in Passing Strange, and John Cullum, who was also just tremendous in everything he does, and he's been doing things for a long But one story that does pop into mind for me about Scottsboro Boys is that when we were doing the show, and in my experience, every creative team kind of loses their friggin' minds come tech and preview. It's true. It's just, they just get to the point where they've been moving along and they've been looking at it for so long and they're preparing for critics to come in and they start being like, oh wait, why did we do that? Maybe we shouldn't do this. You know, they start asking the wrong questions. And I remember I'm the kind of actor, like once I get like two notes about the same thing, I'm just like, okay, wait, what are you seeing? What is it you're trying to find here? And there's a song in the show called It's Gonna Take Time that John Cullum sings, the interlocutor, who is the old, venerated Southern white man who loves the way of life. And he sings this song to Haywood, who's, he's imprisoned and he's falsely imprisoned for this crime he didn't commit. And he says to him, well, it's gonna take time, man. Things will turn out right. It's gonna be okay. It's gonna take time. But it's a very patronizing song. It's brutal to experience as an actor on stage. And they were giving us notes on the lines leading in and out of it, and also they kept shifting some lyrics. And so finally I came to them and I was just like, it was like the week we were gonna open. I was like, what is it you all are getting, or what's going on? What are we trying to do here? And they kind of hemmed and hawed for a second, but then they were like, we just don't want people to feel like this song is the message of the show, because it was also like the penultimate song of the show. And they said they were just worried that people would think that this kind of patronizing message is what our show is about. And I said to them, I was like, I don't really know any other way to put this, but and I understand your fears because as it was talked about when we moved to Broadway, it's this team of 4 white people telling this story about these 9 black boys who were misused and forgotten. And so I understand the self-consciousness there, but I said to them, I was like, you all are telling the truth. And it's beautiful what you've done. Otherwise, we wouldn't be up here performing it and being moved by it as we are. And also I said, it's like, you've moved forward with such clear vision at this point. Like you haven't let your whiteness get in the way. Don't do it now. I was like, you trusted in the truth of what you're doing, and you're honoring these boys in this story. I was like, so just trust it. It's also a debate we had about there's a blackface section in the show, and it's all the elements in the show are very controversial, and they're hard for people to take in different ways. But the piece as a whole, I just told them, I was like, your vision is honest and it is real, and what it evokes from the people who see it is what is there, and that's what's important. And they, it's really funny. You forget that, it's Kander and Ed. Susan Stroman and Tommy Thompson, like these people, they've written incredible shows, they've done incredible work, but even these legends of the business, everybody questions their work, everybody asks questions, and we should, but you have to trust yourself sometimes, and that's important. So that's my experience.